let's talk about the difference between a section grid and CSS grid in the Studio editor. With the section grid, your measurements are all calculated for you. But with the CSS grid, you can control your advanced measurement units to take more control over the responsive behaviors. And the cells of the CSS grids aren't containers like they are on section grids. Instead, they're made up of columns and rows that direct your elements on how to behave across screen sizes. Unlike with section grids, where you can't attach an element to two grid cells at the same time, in a CSS grid, you can. This might be useful when you have a lot of elements overlapping that don't necessarily all fit in the same grid structure. Plus, with the CSS grid, you can add an unlimited number of grid lines, while section grids have a maximum of 16 grid cells. And while you can change the layout of section grids on lower breakpoints, CSS grids give you much more control to have a completely unique layout across breakpoints. And maybe the biggest difference, section grids can only include responsive behavior defaults. So if you want different rows and columns to behave differently across screen sizes, like one column row being fixed while the rest scale proportionally, you'll need to use a CSS grid instead. CSS grids can be a game changer for laying out containers, items in a section grid, items in repeaters, multi-state boxes, and more. So in this lesson, we'll cover how CSS grids can help enhance your page designs. But first, let's get started with how you can add and apply a CSS grid to your pages. There are plenty of ways to add or switch to a CSS grid. Let's start by adding a section grid with two columns. You can add a CSS grid to any cells in a section grid. And remember, section grids are just made up of containers, so the same goes for regular containers too. In this case, let's add a CSS grid to this section grid cell. Just click on the item and go to the Layout panel in the inspector, and next to CSS Grid, click Apply. Choose your starting layout from the floating panel. You can even set a custom layout here. But let's set this grid to 2 by 2 for now. When you do this, you'll be switching from responsive defaults to advanced sizing. So you'll see the actual measurements for these rows and columns. Depending on the responsive default you're using, these measurements will look a little different. In this case, its columns are measured in FR, or fractional units, which we'll get into in just a few minutes. Right now, our row minimum is set to max content, and our max is set to 50%. Max content sets an element's height based on the size of its child elements. In this case, max content tells the row's height to fit the content's current size. You can edit all these measurements in the inspector. So let's attach an image to this cell. Now, let's hit Stretch, which will make the image fill whichever cells it's attached to. We'll attach it to the top left on the canvas, but we can actually change its associated cell position in the inspector here. Or we can hold Shift and span it across two grid areas. That's what we'll do here. Then we can change the container background to black. Next up, let's add a title to the top row, but we'll have it go across both columns. In the inspector, you'll see it's now attached to the two top grid cells. Finally, we'll add a paragraph to the bottom left and a button to the bottom right. Now, the cells are acting as the parents of these elements. So instead of dragging them around to reposition them, we can use the alignment tools. We want this top row to always be the same height as the text. To do that, let's click the row's measurements in the inspector and then change this minimum maximum to max content. Now you can see that the top row got smaller and the bottom row shifted up with it, leaving a gap at the bottom. This is because our second row's max size is set to 50%, meaning it'll only ever grow to 50% of the entire section's height. But we can fix this with that FR measurement unit. So let's change to FR and see what happens. All of your fractional units on a grid added together represent the total available fractional space in the grid. You'll notice that both of our columns are set to fractional. That means on any screen, they'll take up half of the fractional width available. So 1 FR is equal to 1/2 of the space that we've set to FR according to its parent. And down here, the row is also set to 1FR, but its height value is clearly larger than the width of the two columns. This bottom row is the only row set to FR, so it'll take up all the space remaining, after accounting for the other row's measurement. We'll look at another example of that in a second. Now, down in the mobile breakpoint, the desktop layout doesn't quite work. We can start by changing the section grid from columns to rows with this drop-down in the floating panel. Let's change the item grid layout into one column with 3 rows by clicking the CSS Grid, going to the drop-down, and adding custom values here. We can see that the title is placed in the first row. Now, let's place the paragraph and button in the second row by selecting them and choosing the second row in the inspector. Then we'll place the image in the third row. Now our rows have different measurement units, so we'll want to change those to make sure the grid fits the content that's in it. Let's set the first row to max content, so it'll always match the title height on any screen size. And we'll set the second and third rows to FR, so both rows will split the remaining grid height between them. Here's what's happening. An algorithm adds up all the available height in the entire grid to get a measurement for all available space. Then it removes any height measurements, including rows, gaps, margins, and padding, that aren't measured in FR from its total measurement. Whatever's left over, it divides equally by the number of rows that are measured in FR. Right now, we've got 2 rows measured in FR, and they're both the same height, so they're both equal to 1 FR. It's doing the same calculation on the width. At any screen size, this row is still being calculated as 1 fraction of the available fractional space. These measurement units make it so that whatever your grid's height is, it'll always be filled. So, if we want to make the grid taller, we can just change the section height in the inspector, and the grid will follow. So let's add some gaps to the cells, and margins to our content to provide more breathing space. All right, now let's see how all of this looks on different mobile screens with the resize handles. Back on desktop, let's add a fixed column to the left of this section. With the section grid, we can't use different responsive behaviors on different cells, columns, or rows. To do that, we'll need to convert the entire section grid into a CSS grid by right-clicking the section and hitting Switch to CSS Grid. You'll see this warning, telling you that once you switch to CSS Grid, you won't be able to switch back to a section grid. So let's click Switch to CSS Grid. Just like when we switched to single cell, now that we've switched the entire grid to a CSS grid, we'll see its advanced measurements. We can see that the cell from the section grid converts to a container within the CSS grid. You can delete them, and it won't affect the grid we created. And like before, the measurement units you see will be different depending on the responsive behaviors that you've set for your section. So now let's add that new column. By default, adding a new column from the inspector adds it to the right of a grid, but we can add one to the left by clicking this plus icon right on the canvas. So we'll set it to pixels so it stays the same width across all screen sizes. Change the section background and add an element here and here. So now the left column is set to 100 pixels and we've got 2 1FR columns. If these grid measurements are in your way, you can quickly toggle them off by pressing Shift, Command, or Control and G. Then, if we resize with the handles, you can see that the fixed column will always take up 100 pixels of space from the section, but the 1FR columns split the remaining space in half and fill it, no matter how much we scale down. Now let's switch our measurements back on by clicking Shift, Command, or Control and G again. If you ever forget this shortcut, remember, you can find this setting by going to View, Canvas Indications, and Grid Measurements. And set these other 2 columns to %, just to see what happens. Let's say 50-50. we'll see that this won't work because unlike FR, the percentage unit takes its measurement from the entire section without taking the pixels into account. So it's trying to take up 100% of the section's width, causing an overflow of that 100 pixels. To make this work without FR, we'd need to figure out the exact percentage of the section remaining after the pixels, which would be a lot of math. Overall, using percentage here takes more effort and gives us less precision and control. So let's switch back to FR. Now, if we move back down to mobile, you'll notice that the row we added on desktop hasn't appeared. That's because we already edited the grid on mobile earlier, which created an override. So let's add a new row on the bottom here by clicking the plus icon. And then we can just place our new element into the new row. And we'll give it a fixed pixel height too. We'll want the second row to take up 40% of the section height. So let's change that. And we'll finish up by setting that last row to FR, so it takes up the remaining space. Now let's see how all that looks together. You might prefer to start designing first and add a grid later, like with this section we made earlier. You can add grid lines after the fact by clicking on a section and then clicking the Customize Grid on Canvas icon. In this mode, you can drag to adjust existing grid lines, or you can create new grid lines by dragging them in from the edges of a section. When you drag these lines close to a piece of content, they'll snap to it, so it's easy to align them with your design. And you can see the changes made in this mode won't affect the content in the section. To delete any of these grid lines, you can just right-click and delete, or drag them to the edge you originally took them from. You can also delete them from the inspector. Now, when you leave this mode, you can use the grid as if it were any other CSS grid. We've covered a lot in this course, but now you're ready to put it all together to build and customize an advanced, fully responsive section on your own. That's what you'll do in your last challenge for our Essentials course. I'll meet you there.